This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are now a member of the Parthenon podcast network, along with Scott Rank of History Unplugged, James Early of Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim of This American Presidents podcast. Speaking of James Early, a big thanks goes out to Professor James Early of the Key Battles of American History podcast. Links to learn more about James and his podcast can be found at keybattlesofamericanhistory.com. To learn more about the Parthenon Podcast Network, you can go over to parthenonpodcast.com or find all of that and more in the show notes. Now, a great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know more about what you think about the show and help other people learn more about Beyond the Big Screen. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can also contact me there or just send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you again for joining me, Beyond the Big Screen. Thank you so much for coming back to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Today we are joined by Professor James Early, who is an adjunct professor of history at San Jacinto College in Pasadena, Texas, outside of Houston. He's published one book and two scholarly articles. He also runs the blog and Facebook group called American History Fanatics, which is just a great group. And his main areas of research and interest include Eastern European history, the American Civil War, which is going to help us today, and the Cold War. And the movie that Professor Early is going to walk us through today is Glory from 1989. Thank you so much, Professor Early, for coming on the show again.
My pleasure, Steve. It's always fun to sit down and talk history with you.
Oh, thanks. And this is a great movie to talk history about. Today, we are talking about Glory, and we're going to discuss this classic movie, which follows the journey of one of the first army units of the U.S. Civil War made up of African Americans. And this particular unit was the 54th Massachusetts under the leadership of Colonel Robert Shaw. The movie was released in 1989, and it stars Matthew Broderick as Shaw, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, Andre Braugher, and Cary Elwes. It was directed by Edward Zwick, and he's directed many popular books, or popular movies rather, and it's based on the 1965 book One Gallant Rush by Peter Burchard. The famous historian Shelby Foote was one of the technical advisors, and it was released right in about the era of the Civil War by Ken Burns, so it really drew a lot on that popular documentary, and it also won 3 Academy Awards. James, why don't you set up just a little bit, what is the context of this movie and what is it trying to show us?
Sure, Steve. People had been wanting, at least some people on the Union side had been wanting to arm blacks and put them in the Union Army since the beginning of the war, but there was a lot of resistance to that, and Lincoln was resistant to it, and it was mainly because he didn't want to offend the border states. I'm sure most of our listeners know that when the South seceded, not all of the South seceded. You had 4 states that were slave states and were Southern by their culture and their economy for the most part, and they did not secede, and those were Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, and Delaware. There was a pretty significant number of people in these states that did want to secede and did want to join the Confederacy, except for Delaware. Delaware really didn't have much of a secessionist movement, but Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri certainly did. And Lincoln didn't want to push too hard to do anything to, for lack of a better word, to help African Americans or to offend these border states, because he was afraid that if he did something like, say, arm the slaves, the freed slaves, or black people in general, then these governments might go over to the Confederate side. He couldn't afford to do that. But over time, in fact, it's interesting, Union commanders who were operating in the South, like David Hunter, and we'll talk more about him in a minute, they actually formed African-American units just on their own. And some commanders issued proclamations saying the slaves are all free where I am, long before the Emancipation Proclamation. But those proclamations by these individual commanders were superseded or, overthrown, or whatever the word is, by Lincoln. He countermanded them, I guess is the best way to put it. So, but there was an increasing move for African Americans to be put into the Union Army, and it was a groundswell of support, but it was not officially authorized by the U.S. government until the Emancipation Proclamation. That's one thing some people don't know about the Emancipation Proclamation, is that it not only freed the slaves in areas that were still under rebellion, but it also authorized the formation of African-American units. And the 54th was the first unit that was authorized under the Emancipation Proclamation. I guess you could say it was the first officially authorized African-American unit, although there had been others created before that.
It was the first officially authorized. Were there other units that had formed more or less at the same time as the 54th of Massachusetts?
Yes, actually even earlier. You had, for example, 1st South Carolina Regiment, African descent, was formed by David Hunter in South Carolina because he had taken over some of the islands off the coast of South Carolina very early in the war. You also had some Kansas colored regiments. But those were just kind of things that on the initiative of individual commanders, and Lincoln didn't do anything to, cancel those out or to make them go away like he did with the anti-slavery proclamations that I talked about. So there were some, but they were, I don't know if the word unofficial is, they existed, but they were more tolerated by the U.S. government. They were not the direct product of the U.S. government taking action on that.
Let's talk a little bit about how the unit was organized and who it was or whom it was drawn from. The leadership, and it's exemplified in the movie that the Colonel, Robert Shaw, is from a blue blood Boston family, and the leadership is very blue blood Boston. What was the makeup of this unit, both in its leadership and through to the common soldier?
Well, the leadership, first of all, we need to get this out in the open, that the leadership was all white. All the officers were. They would later have non-commissioned officers who were black, meaning sergeants and corporals, but all of the brass, if you will, from the colonel down to the lieutenants were white, and they were all from the blue blood background that you mentioned. They were from the upper crust of Massachusetts society. Most of them were abolitionist in their viewpoints. The Shaws were a major, pretty well-known abolitionist family. And as far as the actual soldiers, of course, they were all black, but most of them were actually free blacks before the war. Most of them were not runaway slaves. And that's one thing that the movie kind of, I don't know if the word is gets wrong or what, but the movie gives you the impression that 90% of the soldiers in the unit were runaway slaves. You see them in the camps and they've got these mismatched uniforms, or not even uniforms at first, mismatched clothing, just kind of tattered clothes and just whatever they could put together. But there were actually quite a few fairly well-known people who were enlisted men in the unit. For example, you had two of Frederick Douglass's sons. And then you had a man who was the grandson of the famous abolitionist Sojourner Truth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it wasn't this ragtag group. Really, a lot more of them were like Thomas, like the character of Thomas. Maybe not as well educated as Thomas, but they weren't all from Massachusetts. They actually went around and recruited people in other states so that they could get the number that they needed. A regiment was typically 1,000 people, at least at the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, they would be much depleted. But so, yeah, the number of runaway slaves in the unit was a fairly small percentage, although there were certainly some.
Now, talking about how the unit was trained, do we know much? They have a training montage in the movie. Do we know to what standards were they trained? And to what specifications? Were they trained to the same specifications as other soldiers were at the time?
Oh, yes, they were. If anything, their training was tougher because the officers Shaw on down wanted to prove that these were real soldiers. There was a lot of opposition in the North to having black soldiers at all. People believed, they're cowardly, they'll run away, they won't fight, which is, of course, completely based on racism, and it was completely incorrect. So, yeah, they wanted to train them and make them tip-top soldiers.
There were several instances in the training where soldiers from the 54th were not provided with adequate equipment, not even rifles. Were they equipped in a similar fashion as other units would have been at that time?
Based on what I have read, that is exaggerated. I know that they got uniforms immediately. There was no long delay, and I don't think the rifles were delayed either. They took a few liberties with the truth in the movie, as all Hollywood movies do, of course, just to make it a little bit more dramatic, to make it more, to put more drama in the situation. There wasn't as much drama. They did get the uniforms right away, and I would assume that the rifles and stuff were as well. It's hard to imagine them walking around with pikes, as happened in the movie.
Now, one thing that did happen during this training section of the film that was based in the historical record was that the African-American soldiers were paid a lower rate than a white soldier was. Now, if I'm not mistaken, a white soldier received private received $13 a month, and the African-American private would receive $10 a month. Was that an accurate, both on what each white soldiers would make and African Americans made? Was that accurate?
Yes, there was definitely originally a lower pay rate for the African American soldiers. The interesting thing about it, though, the movie portrays it as this grassroots rebellion that started with some of the soldiers themselves, and then they show a bunch of them ripping up their pay stubs or their pay vouchers or whatever. And then finally Shaw says, if you men will take no pay, then none of us will. And he rips his in half and they all cheer. And it's a great Hollywood moment. But the fact of the matter is that Shaw was the one who initiated this refusal to accept pay. So it wasn't a bottom up thing. It was a top down thing. And the inequality in pay was not resolved for quite some time until 1864, long after the movie, the end of the movie. And it was a much bigger problem than is depicted in the film. In the film, they show the guys ripping up their pay vouchers, and then Shaw does, and then it goes away, and nobody says anything about it the rest of the movie. But in reality, there were actually a couple of soldiers in the unit that were executed for actions they took while protesting. So in other words, there were some rabble-rousers who were protesting it, but this was later than what was depicted in the film. But yeah, they got executed.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Something like that, even if it's a groundswell and it's against an inequity, that the Army doesn't often take well to that during wartime.
No.
Now, talking about the pay, do you know what $13 a day would equate? Was that $13 a month rather versus 10? Was that something that a laborer would make? Do you know how that would equate to the private economy?
I'm not a big expert on the economics of the time. I have to say, sorry, I don't really know, but I know it wasn't much. I mean, the Army's not famous for paying well, and they certainly don't pay their privates well at all. But
with that pay a decrease of the $10, was that just based solely on racism, or was there some story behind that of why like $10 was chosen as opposed to any other number?
It was strictly racism. That's all there is to it.
They trained and they discussed the training quite a bit. Can you speak at all to how units were trained during the Civil War? Do we know much about how they were trained before they were thrown into combat?
We know some. I mean, in a lot of cases, units weren't trained well at all because there was such a hurry to get them out to the field. But they would have been taught basic drill, how to march. They had very complex formations and I don't know what you call it, operations or tactics they had to do, wheeling around, and you had to keep your line straight. So a lot of it was just marching and drill. And of course, you would have had marksmanship practice as they show In the movie, it was a slow process to fire one of these muskets because you had, well, first of all, it was muzzle loading. You had a little cartridge, a bunch of cartridges in a box, and you would pull them. The box is strapped to your belt, so you'd reach down into this box. It was really made out of leather, and you would pull out one of these things, and you would tear it off with your teeth, and then you would, on one half of it, one side of this little, I don't know what the word is, a little packet, I guess, you would pour down the gunpowder into the barrel, and then you would take the bullet out from the other side and you would stick it in the barrel, and then you would ram it down with the ramrod, and then you would finally have to get a percussion cap, and put it on the firing mechanism, and then you would fire. And what is it they say in the movie? A good man can do 10 shots in a minute,
3 or
6
4
shots. I can't remember what it is, but it's a very slow process, so it took a lot of training.
After they're trained, the unit is actually sent to South Carolina, and they do more of garrison duty as such as more than combat. How was the Massachusetts 54th employed in the theater?
Well, as you mentioned in the movie, they are originally not given combat duty. They are just doing things like chopping down trees and hauling things from one place to another because, again, there was racism. Now, I at least in the book One Gallant Rush, I was not able to find any evidence that was the case. The book seems to indicate that they basically went straight to combat. Who knows? I know there was certainly discrimination against African Americans. I know that a lot of African American units were initially given just menial labor tasks to do, and cooking and things like that. But the 54th seems to be the exception. They seem to have gone straight into combat. They had some battles on James Island before they actually did their famous attack on Fort Wagner.
What was the situation in South Carolina and in the war in general? What year are we talking about where they were actually employed into the field?
Well, it was 1863. That's an interesting thing. For whatever reason, the movie shows their training as beginning in November of 1862. And I think part of that is they wanted to show Christmas. They had the whole thing about Merry Christmas when Thomas tells Robert Merry Christmas and everything. But the unit was not authorized until after the 1st of January, 1863, and the training began in February. So just a few months off. Of course, the attack on Fort Wagner was in July. So it was about 5 months in between when they started training and when they had their first major attack. They did, as I mentioned a minute ago, they had a little bit of skirmishing on James Island. But so that's the timeline.
What was the context of the war? How was the war going at that point?
The war had taken a good turn for the Union. You had, of course, you had the Battle of Gettysburg in July, and they refer to that in the movie. This reporter tells Colonel Shaw about the victory at Gettysburg, but Robert E. Lee had invaded Pennsylvania in June of 1863, and then they collided with the Army of the Potomac on the 1st of July. And on the 3rd of July, the Confederates launched an insane full frontal attack against a fortified position. This is Robert E. Lee's great mistake. And as a result, the Confederates suffered horrible losses and ended up retreating and going back down to Virginia. So that was one major victory for the Union, which happened not long before this. Another one was the capture of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was the last fortress on the Mississippi River that the Confederates still held, and General Grant had laid siege to it a couple months before, and it surrendered on July 4th. So on July 3rd, Gettysburg ended with a Union victory. On July 4th, Vicksburg fell. So that was kind of a 1-2 punch to the Confederacy that really brought down Confederate morale and raised Union morale. But they were determined to capture Charleston, and they had to get Fort Wagner to have any chance of capturing Charleston. So that's why this attack was done.
From our conversation about Lincoln, I'm thinking about that. One of the parts of the Lincoln movie was that they were the Union was trying to take these fortified positions. What was the situation of the coastal Southern defense, and what was the Union trying to do with that?
Well, the Confederates still had several fortified positions on the coast. They had Charleston, they had Wilmington, North Carolina, among others, and they were using these fortified positions to smuggle in supplies, and that was keeping the Confederacy alive. The Confederacy wasn't able to completely feed and clothe itself, so they were dependent to some degree on goods that they were importing from other countries. The Union had a blockade, and they would stop ships that were coming through that they thought had supplies for the Confederacy, but the blockade was not perfect. And it had holes in it, and it wasn't able to stop every single Confederate ship that got through. But the Union figured if they could shut down every single port, then there would be nowhere for these ships bringing supplies to land. So that's what they were trying to do, and that was part of the plan. If I can back up a little, when the war first started, General Winfield Scott, who had been around forever, was the overall commander in charge of the Union Army, and he developed a plan called the Anaconda Plan. And part of that, an anaconda, of course, is a snake that squeezes its prey to death. And part of that was to squeeze the Confederacy by putting a blockade around the coast, shutting down all the ports, and then taking the Mississippi. And that they eventually did that, although it took quite some time. But that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to starve the Confederacy to death by shutting down all their ports and preventing supplies from getting in.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Was that the same General Winfield Scott who fought in the War of 1812?
Yeah, he was he belonged in a museum. He was 75 years old at the start of the Civil War, and he had been a very young general, but a general nevertheless in the War of 1812. He had participated in the Trail of Tears back in the 1830s, and then he was one of the top two generals in the Union Army, or the United States Army more correctly, in the Mexican War. So yeah, he didn't last too long. He was put into retirement pretty early on in the Civil War, but he had a good plan, and it basically is what they ended up following, and it basically worked.
Speaking of the generalship, some of the conflict in the second phase of the movie is with the generals who are running the show in South Carolina. And one of them he was called General Harker, but his actual name was General David Hunter. Tell us a little bit about him and what he was doing at that time.
General Hunter was the commander of the Department of the South. He had led a force that had taken over a couple of the islands off the Sea Islands around Beaufort in that area in South Carolina, and he was one of the ones that declared all the slaves in his jurisdiction freed, but Lincoln countermanded that order. He was actually a close friend of Lincoln's. He had ridden with Lincoln from Springfield, Illinois to Washington on that exciting journey that he had, where he had to go in disguise part of the way. So Lincoln knew him well, and Lincoln trusted him. He wasn't a particularly effective commander, but yeah, first of all, I don't know why the movie changes his name to General Harker in the credits. They actually refer to General Hunter in the beginning of the movie. In fact, it's Robert Shaw's father who was talking about what General Hunter had done with the slaves and how he'd armed some of them. That's the 1st South Carolina that we talked about earlier, 1st South Carolina Regiment, African descent. The interesting thing about the film is it claims that Hunter ordered the destruction and looting of Confederate property. We see how, you remember the scene where Colonel Montgomery takes Shaw and some of his troops out, and Colonel Montgomery lets his African-American regiment run wild and break into houses and smash stuff up and run away with silver and other expensive things. And then he burns down the town. And in the movie, they blame that on General Hunter. In other words, they make it sound like Montgomery is doing that with Hunter's approval. But in reality, the exact opposite was true. General Hunter forbade any kind of looting or pillaging like that, like we see in the movie. Colonel Montgomery, who was a real historical character, of course, he ordered it on his own initiative. And there's also an implication in the movie that Hunter was profiting from the war, that he was taking some of these stolen goods and shipping them off to be sold or just to keep for himself. But there's also no evidence that Hunter personally profited from the war. We believe that he was generally honest, if not the most competent general in the war. And if you don't mind me saying, I want to close the book on him. He eventually is removed from South Carolina, and he goes up and he's put in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864 to stop a Confederate force that's marching up through the valley toward Washington. And the commander of the Confederate force that faces off General Hunter absolutely kicks his butt. Just brushes him aside. And I cannot resist saying that the Confederate commander that licked General Hunter was General Jubal Early. I just can't resist. I got to bring up General Early. Even though
Is he any relation?
Yeah, I don't think so. My dad he spent most of his adult life researching our family history, and he even wrote a book on our family, and he said that was a different branch of the family. But he looks a lot like my grandfather Early, so I'm skeptical. And one of these days when I get some time, I'm going to do some more research on it. But as far as I know at this time, no.
This is totally off topic, but it just so happened my daughter was doing some research for school, and I knew that some of the captain of the other ship during the Nina Pinta and the Santa Maria, obviously Christopher Columbus was the captain of the Santa Maria, but the captain of one of the other ships' last name was Guerra. So you can always, I say he's my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, so you can always just pretend.
Except you're Italian, right? Although maybe they were Italian. I know Columbus was Italian, so maybe he brought some Italians with him.
Yeah, who knows?
You never know.
Who knows what happens in the midst of history? But getting back into focus here, can we talk a little bit about this Colonel Montgomery? Because he was a very interesting character in and of himself.
He was. Montgomery had come from Kansas, and he was they say this in the movie, he's a real Jayhawker. He was one of the people who had fought to make Kansas a free state. I don't want to go into too much detail about bleeding Kansas, but to make a long story short, back in 1854 and 55, and going really up into the early 1860s, you had people that had gone to Kansas who were pro-slavery, and they wanted Kansas to come into the Union as a slave state. And then you had people who had come from the North and settled in Kansas, and they did not want Kansas to be a slave state. And they were supposed to settle this by having an election, but they had a fraudulent election in 1857 and passed a constitution with about 20% of the people voting. The anti-slavery people boycotted it. But for the most part, the people of Kansas decided just to duke it out. We're going to decide whether we're going to be a free or slave state by combat. And they had fist fights and knife fights and even gun fights. They had battles in the streets. And so Montgomery was one of the people who had fought in Kansas to make it, as I said before, make it a free state. They were the Jayhawkers as opposed to the border ruffians, a lot of whom had come over from Missouri. Some people say you could argue that the Civil War started in Kansas in 1855, and it certainly did from a local standpoint.
In this film, throughout the scenes with Colonel Montgomery, they make him out like a paternalistic person, and he's racist really towards his own African-American soldiers. Was that an accurate portrayal of him?
Yes, it is accurate. That's kind of ironic. Even a lot of people who were really strongly anti-slavery were racist, and they thought, he says in the movie, that they're little children, they're little monkeys, and the real Montgomery really did believe that. And he was also a religious fanatic, and the thing that he says, that slavery is like a plague and it's got to be swept away by the hand of God like the Jews of old. That's an actual quote out of the book, One Gallant Rush. So that is very accurate.
Were there a lot of people like him? What was their motivation to end slavery when they were probably as racist as the slave owners, to be so vehement against slavery?
Well, I can't say that this was Montgomery's motivation, but there were a lot of people in the North that they just didn't want slavery because they didn't want any blacks around. Does that make sense? So you may think, how can you be racist and anti-slavery? But some of the western states, northwestern states, including Lincoln's own state of Illinois, at one point passed laws saying no blacks are even allowed to come in and live here. Racism, as you've touched upon, was definitely not unique to the South. The South did not have a monopoly over racism. There was a lot of racism in the North as well. And so, a lot of them were anti-slavery just so there wouldn't be any blacks around.
Moving into some other facets of the movie, one of the big parts of the movie is the attack on Fort Wagner. Can you tell us a little bit about what the military situation was of Fort Wagner and why it was so important to take this particular fortification?
Sure. Fort Wagner was an earthen fort. It was made primarily of just sand. There's probably some wood in there that was holding it up, but it was not a masonry fort like some of the other forts in the area, like Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. And earthen forts were actually very effective because you could shoot a cannonball. Think about it. If you shoot a cannonball into a masonry fort, it's going to blow a big hole in the wall. But if you shoot it into a fort that's made up of dirt and mud and sand, it just goes boop and it sticks. So, Fort Wagner was one of the most powerful forts. It was on the very outskirts of the Charleston Harbor and Charleston Bay. And the Union ships, if they were going to come in and attack the city of Charleston, Fort Wagner was going to be one of the first forts that would start firing at them, and they would suffer decimating fire. The Confederates had forts ringing the harbor, and so they had to be gotten rid of, but Fort Wagner was kind of the first one on the chain. It was one of the first that you would actually encounter fire from, and it could fire in a lot of different directions. So that was why they needed to get rid of it.
Oh, so that's right in the mouth of Charleston Harbor.
Yeah.
And a part of that defensive situation.
Yeah, if you pull up a map and look at it, you'll see how it's like the first in a long string of forts that you would have to go by if you were going to attack the city.
Why at this point in the war did they need to take this fort in particular?
Well, like I said, it was just the first of many they were going to have to take. They couldn't even get to Fort Sumter without going by Fort Wagner. So it's just it's kind of like the first domino to fall. At least that's what they wanted it to be.
So it's the first in this line of dominoes that they need to knock down.
Right.
What put the Massachusetts 54th in the position to be the lead attack force in that? In
the movie, Colonel Shaw volunteers. He says, "We would like to be the first one," and the General Strong says, "Oh, your men haven't slept in 2 days." And he said, "That's all right." And he gives him this speech about, there's more. There's more than rest. There's character, and there's honor, and there's, with this fake Boston accent. But in the actual real world situation, what really happened is General Strong asked the 54th to be the first one. And I think maybe there was part of the reason was they wanted the African Americans to be the first ones to take a crack, and they wanted to give them a shot. They wanted to let them see what they could do. I don't think it was, some might say, well, it was racism because they wanted the black guys to go in and take the initial cannon fodder or take the cannon fire and become cannon fodder. But I don't think that's what it was. I think there was a widespread consensus now that it's time to give black soldiers a shot and let them see what they can do. And they did very, very well.
Cannon fodder seems to be an issue that comes up time and time again in Civil War battles. Was there a particular tactic? Now, we don't want to get too far into military geekery, if you will, but did they have a plan for attacking this fort, or was it to throw the Massachusetts 54th and then the Massachusetts 55th, 56th, like just keep throwing soldiers at it until it eventually fell, or was there a deeper plan involved?
Well, it was mainly just let's charge it and see if we can get in. They underestimated the number of Confederate soldiers that were in there. I think if I remember correctly, General Strong says there's a garrison of about 1,000 men. Well, there were actually I think it was more like 1,500. I don't have the number in front of me, but it was quite a bit more than 1,000. One of the main problems with the Civil War and why it was so deadly and so many people died was because how shall we put this? Military technology had outdistanced military tactics. A lot of the tactics being used, this was not quite so true by the end of the war, but for the first 3-4 years, the tactics being used had not changed much since the days of Napoleon. And back in the time of Napoleon, you didn't have a lot of rifled muskets. You didn't have cannon that were as good as these cannon. So during the time of Napoleon, the offense was often favored, but by the Civil War, the defense was favored. You had better fortifications, as I mentioned. You had better cannon. You had better rifles. You had rifled bores. Rifling just means that there's a groove in the inside of the barrel that the bullet can travel along, and it spins the bullet and makes the bullet much more accurate and much longer range and makes it much more deadly. So the commanders just thought, well, if there's a fort or if there's a entrenched position, we're going to go take it. And you read battle after battle where one side would just order a massive charge against people who were dug in. They were behind a wall or they were in a fort, and they thought, well, we'll just overwhelm them with our numbers. But that didn't happen here. Plus, you had all this sand. It kind of slowed them down. And it was just, this attack was a terrible idea. It was one of these outdated kind of attacks against a fortified position. It should not have ever been ordered. They should have waited until they had more people, but they were in a hurry.
Since we're in this battle right now, do we have a lot of details of how the battle progressed and how successful or unsuccessful the Massachusetts 54th was in this battle?
Sure. We do. The 54, it was pretty accurate what they showed in the movie. A good chunk of them got killed before they even reached the fort. A few people reached the fort, but once they were inside, they weren't able to do much. The reinforcements were slow in coming, and they were captured and made prisoners, or they just got out one way or the other. Somehow they escaped and retreated.
What was the casualties amongst the unit? In the movie, the postscript says that it was over 50%. What was the actual casualty situation?
Yes, that was an exaggeration. It said over half, but it was actually more like 40%. But still, that's a lot of people. If they went in with 1,000, probably they might have been down to 900 by now, 900 effective. So that's going to be, almost half. That's probably about 400 people.
What in the movie, Colonel Shaw was killed. Was he actually killed at the battle?
Yes.
Outright?
Oh, yeah, he was. And his body was thrown into a mass grave with all of his soldiers. The Confederates, generally speaking, both sides respected each other's officers, but they did not respect Colonel Shaw because they saw him as a leader of a slave revolt. And they showed, if you look closely at the bodies being thrown in there, they all are barefoot because the Confederates took their shoes, because Confederates were having so much trouble supplying their armies. A lot of the Confederate soldiers were running around barefoot or with shoes that were in tatters. In reality, the bodies would have been nude. They would have taken their pants and their jackets and everything because they were desperate for supplies and for clothing and everything. But, they're not going to show a bunch of nude guys in the movie, obviously.
Let's follow this line all the way through. What eventually happens to Fort Wagner? Is it taken during this siege?
No, it was not taken during this siege. It was not captured until much later.
What happens to the Massachusetts 54th Regiment after this?
Well, the 54th continues on. The person who is Shaw's second in command assumes command, and he becomes the colonel after Shaw's death. It's interesting that in the movie, just as a side note, Colonel Shaw is the only historical person that they depict in the 54th Massachusetts. The second in command, who was Major Forbes in the movie Cabot Forbes, played by Cary Elwes of Princess Bride fame, the Man in Black. And his accent was not very good in this. He sounds more British than he does Boston. But anyway, sorry about that, Cary. The actual person, the original second in command was named Norwood Hallowell, but then they created another regiment of African-American soldiers, the 55th Massachusetts, and Norwood Hallowell became their colonel, and then he was replaced as second in command by his brother Ned Hallowell. So Ned Hallowell at the time is the lieutenant colonel, and I don't know why they had Forbes be a major. That's not accurate. The second in command of a regiment was always a lieutenant colonel, and unless the lieutenant colonel had just died. But anyway, so it was Ned Hallowell, and he took over the regiment, and they continued to fight throughout the South very bravely. I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but you and I talked about the man who got the the Medal of Honor, who's not even depicted.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about, because there's a lot of interesting people who are a part of this unit who had really interesting lives afterwards as well. Maybe we can zoom in on a couple of these, because like you said, I'm not exactly sure why they did so many of these characters as composites when there was really interesting people who had interesting lives to tell. Maybe we can talk about some of the individual soldiers.
Yeah, William Carney, for example, was the man I was mentioning who eventually he became a sergeant in the regiment, and he was the first African American to be awarded the Medal of Honor. I kind of think that Morgan Freeman's character is more or less meant to depict him, although I think Carney was a much younger man. I don't know that he was that old, but yeah, I think the characters are, as you mentioned, they're composites, they're types. Thomas, of course, is the well-educated African American who's been free all of his life and grew up in Boston reading Hawthorne and sipping wine and things like that and dressing nicely. You have the runaway slaves. You had the field hands like Tripp, who's played by Denzel Washington. You had Jupiter, who's played by, what's his name? Jimmy something or other. I can't remember, but
yeah.
And then you had older, wiser man who's seen the world and he's worked for the Union as a grave digger. That's Morgan Freeman. I think, I don't know why they changed the names. Why wouldn't you want to have Frederick Douglass's two sons? Why wouldn't you want to have William Carney? But they do show Frederick Douglass himself in the movie, but I guess it's just so they don't, so their descendants. We talked about this with the Lincoln movie, how they changed a lot of names and just made up other names. And I think maybe they just wanted to have the freedom to depict the characters the way they wanted to depict them and not offend any possible descendants that are still alive today. That's just my theory.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable, especially, and I think, like you said, this is 1989. I think for me, this was a really first of its sort movie, too. Do you remember when this movie came out?
I do. I went to see it in the theater not long after it came out. It was one of the first dates I ever went on with the lady that's my wife right now, my wife of 27 years. But as you mentioned, it came out right before Ken Burns' Civil War, and it was, to my knowledge, the first Civil War movie we'd had in a long time. And it was just the quality was so good, and it was nominated for all these awards. And if I remember correctly, Denzel Washington actually won Best Supporting Actor. He was very young at the time. It was one of his first roles, kind of a breakout role for him. But it was so well received, and I think it got people interested in the Civil War that maybe weren't before.
Circling back around that, this William Carney person who was he won the Medal of Honor. He was a sergeant. What exactly happened to him at the battle? Because that was a key part of the battle.
Oh yeah, there's a story about how. Well, let's talk about the movie first, and then I'll bring it in. The regimental colors were very important. The rule was you had somebody holding the regimental colors. In other words, they had the U.S. flag as well as the regiment's flag. And if that man were to fall, for whatever reason, wounded or killed, somebody else had to pick them up. You didn't just leave your colors lying on the ground. No. That's a big no. One reason is just for pride, but also because those were often used to rally the troops around. You know, if you got lost or behind or cut off from your unit, you could easily see those regimental colors and you'd know where to go. And in the movie, Colonel Shaw, there's one guy carrying the colors, and he had actually, well, let's back up even more. This is kind of cool, I think. Colonel Shaw had asked Tripp, Denzel Washington's character, to carry the flag as a way of honoring, and I think he was trying to make right with him because he had ordered him to be whipped. And Tripp says, no, I don't want to carry your flag. And so another man is carrying them. And then right before they charge, Colonel Shaw says, if this man should fall, who will carry on with the colors? And Thomas says, I will. You know, Thomas is come along he was a wimp at first, and now he's a tough, hardened soldier. And in reality, it was actually the General Strong, who asked if this man should fall, who will pick up the colors? And Robert Gould Shaw himself, the colonel, said he would. And anyway, what happened eventually is that Carney is the first guy gets shot and he goes down and somebody picks him up and eventually Carney ends up with them. And he used to talk later about how he never dropped him. He never let him hit the ground. So that was kind of a cool story about Carney. In the movie, it's kind of cool that Tripp ends up picking them up. I don't know if Thomas picks them up at all. The original guy gets...
Yeah, I think he does, and then he gets shot, and then somebody else...
Yeah, and Tripp picks him up, despite the fact that he had said he doesn't want to, or didn't want to. So there's a lot of character development. The characters grow beyond their initial limitations, which I think is really great about the movie.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. After this battle, so this is the first battle where African-American soldiers are they're put in a battle where any other unit would have, and they performed at the same level that any other unit would, or even beyond. What happened with other African-American units around the Civil War?
They were used in different places for different things. You can't really make a general statement about it, but they became increasingly used. And by the end of the war, you had, I think it was about 180,000 black men served in Union regiments, and about 20,000 served in the Navy. I may be a little bit off on those numbers, but there was the number that's usually mentioned is about 200,000 total African Americans served in the Union Army.
Did the place of African Americans in the military change after that?
No, sadly, it really didn't. The African Americans are going to serve in all of our major wars after that, including the Indian Wars, and then the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and all those wars, they were segregated. You had black units and you had white units, and the two did not mix. And typically in the black units, the officers were white. I think I know by World War II, you had black officers in at least at the lower levels. I don't know if you had colonels and generals. I don't think you did in World War II. I may be wrong. I'm not a big World War II expert, but I know that you did have black lieutenants and captains, and possibly even majors. So it doesn't really completely change until after World War II. President Truman in 1947 issued an executive order which formally integrated the armed forces. So the first American war in which blacks and whites fought in the same units was the Korean War.
I'd like to take this part of the show to talk about if you were to have a chance to make a movie about the Civil War, and with this particular situation of the Massachusetts 54, what would you have changed with the movie or added to it?
Oh, you mean what changes would I make to Glory?
Yeah, or in general, if you could make your own movie.
Oh.
About these in this action, what would you do
about this action? I don't think I would change a lot from Glory. I mean, Glory, I think, despite the inaccuracies that it has are very minor, and most of them are done for Hollywood reasons, and you can accept that. The changing names, that's no big deal. But I think other than that, it's pretty darn close to a perfect movie. I know, like the whipping scene was not necessary. That was not historically accurate. Whipping had been outlawed much earlier than this, so they wouldn't. Yeah, they would not have whipped a soldier for running away and trying to get shoes or trying to get food like he was trying to do. But other than that, I don't think I would change a whole lot.
There's not a ton of other Civil War movies. Do you think there's an aspect of the Civil War that you'd like to see put in film?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would like to see a movie which has Grant in command. I mean, Grant appears as a character in some movies, but I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing a movie about Grant's early campaigns, like Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh in 1862. I think that would be great. What else? Maybe something that has Sherman, maybe something with the Atlanta and the March to the Sea. I mean, there's so much that needs to be made into movies, but it's just hard. I mean, most people are not all that interested in history, and so you have to have a really, really top-notch movie to get people to come and to make money. Movies like the ones we talked about earlier, Lincoln, 12 Years a Slave, Glory, things like that. Like there's a movie called Gettysburg, which came out in 1994, which was it's a fantastic movie. But if you're not a history buff, you probably wouldn't like it too much because, well, first of all, it's really, really long. It's 4 hours long almost. And I tell my students that and they go, "Oh man, how could you do that?" And I say, "Man, I went saw it in the theater and I sat through the whole thing. And when it was over, I said, already?" But I mean, that's just me. I'm a history geek and especially a Civil War geek. And it's a very well made movie, but it's just not, it's not the kind of, it's more like, almost like a documentary. So, but hopefully, you know, I'm hearing rumblings of movies coming out that are under planning about that they may make a movie based on Grant's life based on the new biography by Ron Chernow. I've heard there's supposed to be an Andrew Jackson movie or miniseries coming out. There's supposed to be a Washington biopic coming out. Now, of course, that's not Civil War, but I think this is a good time. I think people's interest in history is gradually increasing. And of course, our population, the American people as a whole, are getting older. You know, the graying of America you hear about. And I think people, as they get older, they get more interested in history. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, I think too, when I spoke, this seems to be a theme that's coming up time and time again in these episodes, especially when it comes to history. And I was speaking to our mutual history friend, Scott Rank, and with the explosion of Netflix, we can have whole television series that are 8-9 episodes long where individual characters can get developed better. And I think that that's really going to change history in film and TV.
Oh, absolutely. There's all kinds of cool miniseries that are, I don't know, not a miniseries in the old sense like North and South or Blue and Gray or something, but just TV shows that last 2 seasons, 3 seasons, 4 seasons. And you're right. You can do a lot more. Like the classic example that jumps out into my mind is Turn, Washington Spies. You and I have talked a little about that in the past. I mean, it's not super accurate, but I mean, it's beautiful. It's a fantastic show. It's really more, I guess, historical fiction based on a true story. There was a show called Underground about the Underground Railroad. I think it was canceled after 2 seasons, but it was terrific. And then there's just other ones. There's a lot of other ones that the name of them doesn't jump out at me right away. But yeah, I think people who do these series, particularly on Netflix, are willing to roll the dice a little bit more and take gambles on doing different areas of history that maybe movie makers are not willing to do. But, you know, having said that, there's so many historical movies coming out these days and good ones too. You think about Dunkirk. There's this year we had The Darkest Hour with Churchill, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm planning to go pretty soon. You had Free State of Jones, which is a Civil War and early Reconstruction movie. You had Birth of a Nation about the Nat Turner Rebellion. So I think we're starting to see that history sells and it pays. At least I hope so.
You have a lot of other history projects going on. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about some of the things you have going?
I got too many. Well, in addition to my classes that I teach, I've been a guest on a lot of podcasts lately. I've done some episodes with Come and Take It, which is, if our listeners don't know, it's a podcast about Texas history and culture. And we're doing a projected 5 or 6 part series on Texas during the Civil War. And we've recorded 2 so far. I got to get cracking on writing some more scripts on that sometime in my voluminous spare time. But we also did a thing. I did a thing with Scott Rank, who you just mentioned, on Presidential Fight Club. And I don't know if some of your listeners have probably heard of it by now, but it was a thing I just thought of. What if you took all 44 U.S. presidents when they're about 35 or 40 years old and pulled them out of history and put them in a ring and just had them fight mano a mano, one-on-one, no, as they say in The Princess Bride, no tricks, no weapons, skill against skill alone. And it was a lot of fun. And I run a Facebook group, as you mentioned earlier, called American History Fanatics, which is just a fantastic group of folks and a lot of fun and really, really sharp people that contribute to that group. They help me keep it running. And I had them vote on who wins each fight. So you might have, let's say, Martin Van Buren versus Grover Cleveland. Okay. And then they fight, and then the people would vote, and whoever won would be move on to the next round. We had brackets, kind of like the NCAA basketball tournament, and you would keep going, and people would be eliminated, and gradually we got down to only 4 presidents left, and then we had 2, and then we had a champion. So if your listeners are interested, you can. Scott Rank and I made these into a series of short podcast episodes, and they're on his podcast called History Unplugged.
Yeah, you should definitely check that out. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. It was really fun. We broke it down, and we acted almost like we were cheerleaders for each president. He would say, here's why this guy should win. And I'd say, no, this guy's going to win, and so on. And then we would reveal the result.
Well, it was really wonderful to talk with you today, James. And I'm definitely looking forward to having you on again, talk more about history and movies.
Oh, I can't wait to. This is always a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on, Steve.